Hello, my name's Mattie. Welcome to my Storyland. Samuel Langhorne Clemens, known to the world as Mark Twain, was born in Missouri in 1835. This great American writer and humorist led a fascinating life. He made and lost many fortunes, wrote prolifically, was fascinated by technology and future science, was a journalist, a lecturer, a steamboat pilot, a traveler, an ardent abolitionist, a Freemason, fought for women's rights, worked for a time in politics, and also happened to write Huckleberry Finn, perhaps the first great American novel. Both Ernest Hemingway and William Faulkner considered him to be the father of modern American literature. The celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, published in 1865, was his first great success. This classic American tall tale, filled with satire and hyperbole, is not Twain's originally. Rather, it is his adaptation of a story he had heard from his days in the mining camps of western Nevada. And today, it is my pleasure to read it to you. Are you ready? Then let's begin. The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, by Mark Twain. In compliance with the request of a friend of mine, who wrote me from the East, I called on good-natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler, and inquired after my friend's friend, Leonidas W. Smiley, as requested to do, and I hereunto append the result. I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that, if I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of his infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me nearly to death with some infernal reminiscence of him as long and tedious as it should be useless to me. If that was the design, it certainly succeeded. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably by the barroom stove of the old dilapidated tavern in the ancient mining camp of Angels, and I noticed that he was fat and bald-headed, and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. He roused up and gave me good day. I told him a friend of mine had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood, named Leonidas W. Smiley, Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel who he had heard was at one time a resident of Angel's Camp. I added that if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about this Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, I would feel under many obligations to him. Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner and blockaded me there with his chair, and then sat me down and reeled off the monotonous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never smiled, he never frowned, he never changed his voice from the gentle flowing key to which he tuned the initial sentence. He never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm. But all through the interminable narrative there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity, which showed me plainly that, so far from his imagining that there was anything ridiculous or funny about his story, he regarded it as really important matter, and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent geniuses in finesse. To me, the spectacle of a man drifting serenely along through such a queer yarn without ever smiling was exquisitely absurd. As I said before, I asked him to tell me what he knew of Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and he replied as follows. I let him go on his own way and never interrupted him once. There was a fellow here once by the name of Jim Smiley, in the winter of '49, or maybe it was the spring of '50. I don't recollect exactly, somehow, though what makes me think it was one or the other is because I remember the big flume warn't finished when he first came to the camp. But anyway, he was the curiousest man about always betting on anything that turned up you ever see. If he could get anybody to bet on the other side, and if he couldn't, he changed sides. Any way that suited the other man would suit him. Anyway, just so's he got a bet. But still, he was lucky, uncommon lucky. He almost always come out winner. He was always ready and lame for a chance. There couldn't be no solitary thing mentioned, but that feller'd offer to bet on it, and take any side you please, as I was just telling you. There was a horse race. You'd find him flush, or you'd find him busted at the end of it. There was a dog fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he'd bet on it. Why, if there was two birds sitting on a fence, he'd bet you which one would fly first. Or if there was a camp meeting, he'd be there regular to bet on Parson Walker, which he judged to be the best exhorter about here. And so he was, too, and a good man. If he even seen a straddle-bug start to go anywheres, he would bet you how long it would take him to get wherever he was going to. And if you took him up, he'd follow that straddle-bug to Mexico, but he would find out where he was bound for and how long he was on the road. Lots of the boys here had seen that Smiley and can tell you about him. Why, it never made no difference to him. He'd bet on anything, the dandest feller. Parson Walker's wife lay very sick once, for a good while, and it seemed as if they weren't going to save her. But one morning he come in, and Smiley asked how she was. And he said she was considerable better, thank the Lord for his infinite mercy, and coming on so smart that with the blessing of Providence she'd get well yet. And Smiley, before he thought, says, "But I'll risk 2.5 that she don't, anyway." This year Smiley had a mare. The boys called her the 15-minute nag, but that was only in fun, you know, because, of course, she was faster than that, and they used to win money on that horse, for all she was so slow and always had the asthma, or the distemper, or the consumption, or something of that kind. They used to give her a 200 or 300 yard start, and then pass her underway, but always at the fag end of the race she'd get excited and desperate-like, come cavorting and straddling up and scattering her legs round limber, sometimes in the air and sometimes to one side among the fences, and kicking up more dust and raising more racket with her coughing and sneezing and blowing her nose, and always fetch up at the stand just about neck ahead, as near as you could cipher it down. He had a small little bullpup, but to look at him you think he warn't worth a cent, but to sit around and look ornery, lay for a chance to steal something. But as soon as the money was up on him, he was a different dog. His underjaw began to stick out like the forecastle of a steamboat, and his teeth would uncover and shine savage like the furnaces. And dog might tackle him and bullyrag him and bite him and throw him over his shoulder 2 or 3 times, and Andrew Jackson, which was the name of the pup, Andrew Jackson would never let on but what he was satisfied and hadn't expected nothing else. And the bets being doubled and doubled on the other side all the time till the money was all up, then all of a sudden he would grab that other dog just by the jint of his hind leg and freeze on it. Not chew, you understand, but only just grip and hang on till they throwed up the sponge, if it was a year. Smiley always come out winner on that pup, till he harnessed a dog once that didn't have no hind legs, because they'd been sawed off by a circular saw. And when the thing had gone along far enough and the money was all up and he come to make a snatch for his pet Holt, he saw in a minute how he'd been imposed on, and how the other dog had him in the door, so to speak. And he appeared surprised, and then he looked sort of discouraged like, and didn't try no more to win the fight, and so he got shucked out bad. He give Smiley a look as much to say his heart was broke, and it was his fault for putting up a dog that didn't have no hind legs for him to take hold of, which was his main dependence in the fight. And then he limped off a piece and laid down and died. He was a good pup, was that Andrew Jackson, and would have made a name for himself if he'd lived, for the stuff was in him, and he had genius. I know it, because he hadn't had no opportunities to speak of, and it don't stand to reason that a dog could make such a fight as he could under them circumstances, if he hadn't no talent. Always makes me feel sorry when I think of that last fight of his'n and the way it turned out. Well, this year Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats and all them kind of things till you couldn't rest and you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on, but he'd match you. He catched a frog one day, took him home, and said he calculated to educate him. So he never done nothing for 3 months but set in his backyard and learn that frog to jump. You bet you he did learn him, too. He'd give him a little punch behind, and the next minute you'd see that frog whirling in the air like a doughnut. See him turn one somerset, maybe a couple, if he had a good start. Come down flat-footed and all right like a cat. He got him up so in the matter of catching flies and kept him in practice so constant that he'd nail a fly every time as far as he could see him. Smiley said all the frog wanted was education, and he could do most anything, and I believe him. Why, I've seen him set Daniel Webster down here on this floor — Daniel Webster was the name of the frog — and sing out, "Flies, Daniel, flies." Quicker'n you could wink, he'd spring straight up and snake a fly off the counter there, flop down on the floor again as solid as a gob of mud, and fall to scratching the side of his head with his hind foot as indifferent as if he had no idea he'd been doing any more'n any frog might do. You never see a frog so modest and straightforward as he was, for all he was so gifted. And when it comes to fair and square jumping on a dead level, well, he could get over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever see. Jumping on a dead level was his strong suit, you understand? And when it come to that, Smiley would ante up money on him as long as he had a red. Smiley was monstrous proud of his frog, as well he might be, for fellers that had travelled and been everywheres all said he laid over any frog they ever see. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a little lattice box, and he used to fetch him downtown sometimes and lay for a bet. One day a feller, a stranger in the camp, he was come across him with his box, and he says, "What might it be you got in the box?" And Smiley says, sorta indifferent like, "It might be a parrot, or it might be a canary, maybe, but it ain't. It's only just a frog." And the feller took it and looked at it careful and turned it round this way and that and says, "So 'tis. Well, what's he good for?" "Well," Smiley says, easy and careless, "he's good enough for one thing. I should judge he can out-jump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the box again and took another long, particular look, and give it back to Smiley, and says, very deliberate, "Well, I don't see no points about that frog that's any better than any other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley says. "Maybe you understand frogs. Maybe you don't understand 'em. Maybe you've had experience. Maybe you ain't only an amateur, as it were. Anyways, I've got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 that he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." And the feller studied a minute, and then he says, kind of sad-like, "Well, I'm only a stranger here, and I ain't got no frog. But if I had a frog, I bet you." And then Smiley says, "That's all right, that's all right. If you'll hold my box a minute, I'll go get you a frog." So the feller took the box, put up his $40 along with Smiley's, and sat down to wait. So he sat there a good while, thinking and thinking to himself, and then he got the frog out and prized his mouth open, took a teaspoon, filled him full of quail shot, filled him pretty near up to his chin, set him on the floor. Smiley, he went to the swamp and slopped around in the mud for a long time, and finally he catched a frog and fetched him in, give him to this feller, and says, "Now, if you're ready, set him alongside of Daniel, with his forepaws just even with Daniel, and I'll give the word." Then he says, "1, 2, 3, jump!" And him and the other feller touched up the frogs from behind. The new frog hopped off. But Daniel, he give a heave and hoisted up his shoulders so like a Frenchman. But it warn't no use. He couldn't budge. He was planted as solid as an anvil. He couldn't make no more stir than if he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised. He was disgusted, too. But he didn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The feller took the money and started away, and when he was going out at the door, he sort of jerked his thumb over his shoulder this way at Daniel, and says again, very deliberate, "Well, I don't see no points about that frog that's any better than any other frog." Smiley, he stood scratching his head and looking down at Daniel a long time, and at last he says, "I do wonder what in the nation that frog throwed off for. I wonder if there ain't something the matter with him. He appears to look mighty baggy somehow. And he catched Daniel up by the nape of the neck, and he lifted him up and says, "Why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pound." Turned him upside down, and he belched out a double handful of shot. Then he see how it was, and he was the maddest man. He set the frog down and took out after that feller, but he never catched him. And here Simon Wheeler heard his name called from the front yard and got up to see what was wanted. And turning to me as he moved away, he said, "Just sit where you are, stranger, and rest easy. I ain't going to be gone a second." But by your leave, I did not think that a continuation of the history of the enterprising vagabond Jim Smiley would be likely to afford me much information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, so I started away. At the door I met the sociable Wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me and recommenced. Well, this year's Smiley had a yellow one-eyed cow that didn't have no tail, only just a short stump like a banana, and "Oh, hang Smiley and his afflicted cow," I muttered good-naturedly. Bidding the old gentleman good day, I departed. And with that, I bid you farewell. I hope you enjoyed the story. Perhaps I'll see you again. I certainly hope so. Until then. Hello, Mattie here. Thanks for watching me read stuff. There are lots more videos of me reading stuff over on my channel, and if there's other stuff you'd really like me to read, just let me know in the comment section below. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and I upload new videos all the time, so maybe hit the bell icon too, so you can get notified when new stuff comes out. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time.